Hello and welcome to the Fish Tank Talk. And I'm bobbing around in here with Tony Douglas, the CEO of Etihad Airways. Welcome to the Fish Tank, Tony. It's a new experience for me, and I can't imagine you've been swimming around with sharks in this either. So let's look at this at the moment. We're here in the aviation industry, and surely as being an airline CEO, it's got to be the toughest time ever. You've got taxes, you've got rising fuel prices. Of course, we're coming out of COVID. And then with COP26 happening, of course, the world's attention is on sustainability, and a lot of that is focusing on airlines. So how are you coping with all of that pressure?
Well, I think first of all, I've never been in a fish tank like this before either. So an interesting concept, but great question. And let's face it, the last 18 months for commercial aviation has probably been the most challenging that any of us have ever seen. But I think where you led up to in the question was around sustainability. And here we are at Dubai Airshow. I think everybody's got that kind of spring in their step because it's great to be back to a degree of normality. I've said to a few people yesterday and today, I, for one, feel energized by something that perhaps we all used to take for granted, the way in which we come together, the way in which we do business, the way in which we enjoy something as simple as an air show, until, of course, it's taken away. And then you realize just how special these moments and opportunities are for the whole community to come together under one roof. And I think in the same way that the IATA AGM in Boston, I know you and I were in Qatar last week for the Arab Air Carriers Association AGM, and also here at the Dubai Air Show, sustainability is front and center. It is no longer the kind of additional part of the conversation towards the end. It really is the main event itself. And I think we were doubly proud, given the fact that this weekend just passed, COP28 has been announced to be hosted within the United Arab Emirates. So there's probably not a better time to illustrate and proof point what we're doing in the world of commercial aviation sustainability. And yesterday's official opening flyby, it perhaps therefore wasn't any surprise that it was the Greenliner 787 aircraft which led the whole of the flyby. That's been an environmental test bed for the last 2 years. It was launched here in 2019 at the air show, and since then it's done some remarkable work in demonstrating what can be done with many of the more informed members of the community for the furtherance of aviation sustainability.
Because that's great, isn't it? Because a lot of people are talking about sustainability and the future, and we are going to be doing this, that, or the other. But as you said, we don't really appreciate some things until they're taken away. And of course, the argument is on planet Earth, it could be taken away, and we wouldn't have appreciated what we could have done. But it is actually the present that you're doing. You've got this cracking aircraft out on the display line as well, promoting that sustainability issue. Let's talk about the flight in October, because you had a flight coming, I think, from London. Tell us about that, because that was pretty unique, wasn't it, in the way that it operated?
So it was a unique flight. It was the 23rd of October, and it was one of a number of sustainable flights we've operated the Greenliner upon. This one in particular was 72% more carbon efficient than the equivalent flight in 2019 that we operated. So over a 2-year period, 72% improvement. And I say that deliberately slowly because understandably lots of people think maybe I've misheard that 72%. Let me unpack it for the reasons why. So first of all, the equivalent flight, and there's no avoiding the reality that 2 years earlier our equivalent flight was an A380, so obviously 4 engines, a generation earlier, heavier aircraft, it burns a lot more fuel, etc. So 787, obviously our Greenliner, far more efficient. So that was the first element. Second element is we operated with 38% sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. And people often say to us, my goodness me, 38% must have been the outcome from a very complex algorithm to determine what the ultimate blend was. And the honest answer is it was 38% because we simply couldn't get any more. And I think that kind of points to one of the broader challenges that we all have in this space, which maybe we'll come back to later. So there was a sizable sustainable aviation fuel blend that went with it. The third element is we worked with Eurocontrol and the air traffic control authorities here in the UAE to do the optimum route plan to make sure that the climb was maximised and continuous, and more importantly, continuous descent. The outcome of that was a 40-minute reduction in flight time and a 6-ton reduction in CO2. And the fourth major element is working with a number of other technology providers on the Greenliner program, is the way in which we sought to eliminate sizable parts of the condensation trails that commercial aircraft make at high altitude. And that was a function of, again, of optimum flight planning to avoid certain barometric pressure, air temperature and weather patterns that create larger condensation trails, contrails. Add those four big pieces together, 72% improvement in the carbon footprint of that particular flight. I think it gives a confidence that it is a problem that together over time we can find a solution to, but there's no silver bullet, there's no one big leap that's going to get there. And I think what the Greenliners perhaps help do as well is promote the fact that regulators, policy setters and governments have got as big a part to play in this as airlines and manufacturers.
Yeah, and let's. I'm going to come back on a number of those points, but let's start first of all with the fuels, and that 38% being the most you could get. I mean, I know there are restrictions on certain engines. We haven't got the regulator approvals for 100% yet, and so obviously that's going to make a difference. But two things really. Of the 72% saving over the previous flight 2 years ago, how much impact did the sustainable fuels make in that saving? So even if you'd been at 100% sustainable fuel, would it have been a much, much, much bigger saving? And what about your partner oil companies, the energy companies that you talk to? When is parity going to be reached? When are you going to be not having to pay as much for sustainable fuel as you are now? So let's talk about the fuels company. Let's put the energy businesses under a bit of pressure.
So I think if I go back to the Heathrow 23rd of October Greenliner flight first, the 38%, which I've already explained, is 38% of a sustainable fuel that is 3 times X more expensive than regular Jet 1 aviation fuel. So there's an affordability sustainable challenge to go there as well. Now obviously greater supply will normally correlate to a significant improvement in price. But also back to the October Greenliner flight, even the 38% that we Etihad procured, it ended up being put into the overall fuel farm. And we took a credit for the 38% we put in, but the 38% didn't go into our aircraft because the infrastructure simply doesn't exist today. So there's an infrastructure challenge, there's a commercial sustainability challenge, and there is an availability challenge. So I think, we all accept that these things can only improve if some of the big energy companies, the oil companies, continue, which they are doing, in working to promote more effective ways of producing SAFs and to therefore improve as volumes get greater the commercial price point that one accepts with it. But it also comes back to the infrastructure point I was making earlier. So yesterday here at the Dubai Airshow, we also signed into with Etihad a waste conversion project, so taking municipal waste and creating from that sustainable aviation fuel. And I guess where this is going is there's probably no clear one solution at the moment of how you get the blend from enough material available and a commercial price point which will make it economical. But to the first point of the question, there's not a certifiable way for 100% at this point in time. And in fact, Etihad currently holds the world record for the longest flight on 50% SAF. So we've had a 14-hour duration flight on 50%. So I think there's a whole combination of technology, source and availability, commercial economics and infrastructure, and all of those will need to be cracked.
And this is chicken and egg then, isn't it, really? Because I've spoken to the energy companies who have said, well, there's not enough demand. And I wonder, is there? Because if the airline industry is truly behind this, surely the demand is there. And the second point is there enough feedstock to enable it to do it? You're talking about the waste deals, and we've had biofuels that we've been worked as well in Abu Dhabi as well. So who leads it? How do we actually make it happen and not just talk about it?
So I think there's probably a few components in my mind to this. Perhaps if we'd have been sat here when we first launched the Greenliner 2 years ago, having this conversation, we might not even be talking about SAFs then, even though they were available. So I think there's a sign of progress that IATA, AGM in Boston, last week as I referred to in Qatar, and here again today, lots of us are talking about this particular chicken and egg type of dilemma. So I think if nothing else, there's a collective understanding of what the problem set is. I believe that there'll be probably a combination of things that will continue to develop the sustainable aviation proposition. I think the availability of green hydrogen will be key to this. I think the exploration of other hydrogen derivative fuel stuffs will probably be a key part to this. And I think what we'll also see is the way in which potentially some of the waste to energy recycled inputs to green fuels is a way forward. But what I also think is a part that needs to be emphasised is policy setters, regulators and governments again, because the vocabulary of the penalty, the taxation, the stick, so to speak, probably needs to be enabled and facilitated a lot more with the carrot, i.e. the means by which people are incentivised to cross the bridge into an alternative fuel farm. And I think it's analogous to what's happened with electric power in automobile technology. You know, it gathered a degree of momentum such that then policy setters, regulators and governments probably accelerated it in the way in which they incentivise certain technologies and penalise certain others. So I think it's a combination of all of the above.
And certainly when you talk about governments and regulators, you alluded in the discussion about that flight of being able to fly direct, to not be tied up on some of the archaic air routes we have. So when does that change? It's taken years so far for Europe to get their act together, and when are we going to see something different?
So I don't think the subject matter in general comes with any dead simple solutions, the one-shot resolution, the silver bullet, so to speak. It's a combination. I think everybody acknowledges that. I think in air traffic control in particular, there is a potential big win, but to be able to get international alignment as well as local alignment in many cases is easy to talk about, but politically and systemically very, very difficult to achieve. And I think if you look at Western Europe and North America, I stay with Western Europe for this analogy, a lot of the major cities, the road systems were almost a function of what the Romans did thousands of years earlier that then just got developed and built upon. It's not fundamentally dissimilar to the routing networks in the sky, where decades and decades earlier they were laid out when aircraft had propellers, their average flight durations were much shorter, and of course that legacy, in the same way the Roman road networks influenced a lack of direct routing in many European countries, is no different than what we see in the sky. So I think this is one where drawing attention to it, back to the Greenliner, it's no longer an academic or philosophical point. It's got hard proof points and it's evidenced. 40 minutes time saving, which means fuel burn 40 minutes less, which means over 6 tons of CO2. And I think it's really using that evidentially in order to try and get policy setters, regulators and governments to align around this one. Because whilst what we're talking about isn't conceptually complex, how you change it is. And I think the what and how is the interesting 2 dimensions in this one.
Yeah, and like building a new motorway to replace a Roman road, it's pretty hard to get the funding to do that. So an important point for governments to do. Let's just go on a little bit more with what Etihad's doing, because I remember probably 2 years ago now, we were talking about the removal of some of the single-use plastics on the aircraft. How are you getting on with that interiors message? The bit passengers can actually be involved with as well.
Yeah, so I actually think it's appropriate to stress 2 things. So again here, Dubai Airshow, we're delighted it's no longer just a story about the Greenliner. We've now introduced the Sustainable 50. So on the apron, you'll see the 2nd aircraft in our sustainable fleet. The Sustainable 50 is an Airbus A350, and of course linking to the industry's overall acknowledgement of being carbon neutral by 2050, but most importantly celebrating that this year is the 50th anniversary of the formation of the United Arab Emirates. So we've introduced the Sustainable 50 alongside the Greenliner, obviously an Airbus machine with Rolls-Royce XWB motors, and Greenliner Boeing machine with Generation X, Gen X motors from GE. So we've got a broader collaboration which we've signed and refreshed here today, so it will be probably covered online tomorrow progressively, how all of us are trying to connect to moving this agenda forward. However, it's not all about the big conceptual ideas, it's about all the little details. There's no copyright on bright ideas, I might have said that earlier, and when you get to the single-use plastics, on that Heathrow flight that I've mentioned already, we took out over 80% of the single-use plastics from that flight. The refresh on our cabin offering is even more aggressive on that through what we've learned through the Greenliner and engaging supply chains that have come with some really innovative ideas. And if I just call out one in particular, the water company, Alain, have come forward and said to the Greenliner program, we have been experimenting with a plant-based material that can replace the plastic bottle and is completely biodegradable, such that when the bottle's discarded, even if you did nothing, it would just naturally dissolve over time. Now, the Greenliner as a persona is almost a go-to place. If anybody out there is in the possession of a genius idea and you're seeking a way to put it to the test in commercial aviation, the Greenliner or the Sustainable 50 is the go-to place going forward.
It sounds great, and you're right though, it is far more than just about sustainable fuel if we're going to get this right. And also I guess there's an emphasis on manufacturers as well. You talk about the deals with Rolls-Royce, also Airbus and Boeing, when it comes to how we build the aircraft and what we make the fuselage from and things like that. So I mean, you're working, I hope, with development with them to push manufacturers to do those things.
Well, we are, albeit I think it's fair to say the reason why the Greenliner has been so successful and the Sustainable 50 is they represent the 2 most efficient aircraft available today. They both have carbon structures. They are significantly lighter and aerodynamic than the previous generation that was available. And the same with Gen X, GE's power plant, and XWB, the fuel burn performance of those. And to put it into context, Dreamliner versus the earlier equivalent type is 21% more fuel efficient. Now, I'm an engineer by background, When I was brought up in engineering many decades earlier, if you'd have gone from one to the next generation and made even 2.1% improvement on fuel burn performance and everything that's associated with it, it would be a lap of honour and 3 cheers. I think it's an illustration of what the industry and the manufacturers are doing. But to your point, it comes down to all the little things. So we're 3D printing now lots of components on board because we can get the same representative quality geometry but reduce a lot of weight. And of course, as we all know, weight directly influences fuel burn. So it's not just about always the big things, every little bit contributes.
So do you feel, Tony, then, as an industry, the aerospace industry is actually playing its part in the battle for net zero? Because I questioned this on one point, that I know with COP26, we became the industry that you focused on as the dirty players. There's 400 business jets turn up in Glasgow. Look at all the fuel they burned. The aviation industry is doing nothing. We're a dirty business. What are we doing wrong in the way that the Gretas of this world are not standing up and saying, hey, you guys are saving 40%, 50% on what you were doing 10 years ago? That's great. Carry on. They're not. They're saying we should be doing it now.
And I think, look, we should be doing it now. There's no avoidance. I don't think there's any denial. But I think it's actually difficult to argue that the manufacturers and the airlines are doing nothing, because they clearly are not. If we'd have come to a show like this, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, half the technologies that are on display now simply would not even be available at that point in time. So I think in terms of technological advancement, there are many examples that I could cite that have made big contributions. But the simple fact remains, burning fossil fuels with aviation fuel creates CO2, which is clearly undeniable. We can improve it. We've made big commitments to how we get to zero. I think the illustrations from the Greenliner and going forward the Sustainable 50 will probably give us the confidence that we can do more. And quite frankly, we have to do more. And the only balance I think I put back to this one again is, I think the airlines in general acknowledge this. Some can do more than others, dependent upon where they're up to with fleet replacement strategies, given the older aircraft are obviously handicapped a lot more in that regard. I think the manufacturers, when we listen to them, are putting more of their R&D dollars than ever before into how they can make more sustainable next generation products. But regulators, policy setters and governments have got a really big part to play in this now. And I guess what I would call out for is a levelling of that playing field, such that the shared responsibility, and I don't think there's any way in which we'll crack this problem without that shared responsibility, is taken more broadly.
And with governments, I know, talking to Sama Majali from Gulf Air yesterday, and Royal Jordanian yesterday, and he was saying as well that the fear is that governments are going to tax our industry even further, which is one way to put the prices up. And I think if we don't do something, the penalty is going to be that we're going to have to be paying more as airlines, and we've got to pass that on to passengers. So flying could become a lot more expensive, as it was perhaps 20 or 30 years ago as a point, and that will reduce the number of people flying. So would the environmentalists argue, well, actually, that's a pretty good thing, tax them further so fewer people fly? Or can we manage it? How do we deal with this problem?
So it's a big challenge, and I guess the two bookends in my way of explaining this are as follows. Governments probably need to look at incentivising slightly more than taxing. Now, there's always a balance in that relationship, but I think to date, we've heard too much around the negative, i.e. the stick, the taxation, probably nowhere near enough around the incentivisation, the carrot. And I think that's something that many nations need to think quite deeply about, because human nature and history shows us that the balance between those two actually influences a shift in behaviour, and particularly around incentivisation. But you then look what's going on all around us outside of this fish tank. People are mingling. We're at a very busy show, and it's a function of what we described, or I described before. There is a societal issue here where people want to travel, they need to travel, there's a fun to travelling, there is a purpose to travelling, and with 2/3 of the world's population within 6 flying hours of where we're sitting in this fish tank, with a growing demographic profile, I think we're going to end up with a demand side which will drive that naturally. So the only response therefore is, I think responsibly to this problem, is how we continue the agenda on technologies evolving, the commitment to the way in which the airlines and the manufacturers collaborate together, putting all of the small solutions into play with the big ones as well, but getting the policy setters, the governments and the regulators to play their part too.
And we don't want people to feel guilty about flying anywhere.
Why should you?
Which brings me to my final question, and as ever, it's all about people. And we know that some of the research is showing now that younger people coming into industry want to be associated with net zero companies. How do you feel within Etihad that your people are? Are they totally behind what we're doing? And is this going to be the best way we can encourage people to avoid the shortage of human resource that we're likely to get?
So I think what I'm about to say is a statement of the obvious, given the way in which we understand attitudes have rightly evolved and developed, and in particular with the slightly younger generation and you and I, sir. Etihad is a very diverse organisation. We proudly have an Etihad family with 121 different nationalities. So even if we didn't want to be diverse, by definition we are. The average age is 32. As a consequence, there is a totally different drive and demand for supporting a sustainable business and playing their part in it. But if I then go to the other side of it, which is back to demand, people who want to travel, we're starting to see that whilst price will ultimately always be the number one differentiator, that so many people now are making decisions based upon the environmental conscience. And I would probably leave it by putting it out there. At an air show like this, in a decade's time, the airlines that will be the winners and the losers, the winners will be the ones who've done the most in this space, and I would suspect the losers will be the ones who clearly have not, because ultimately the ticket buying public, the traveller, in our case our guest, will be the people who will influence the outcome more than anything else.
Tony Douglas, thank you very much for giving us that story today.